In the final years of Louis XIV, when the French court still shimmered in gold and theology still spoke in thunder, a child was born into a kingdom that believed itself complete. The Sun King had ruled for decades. Bishops guarded eternity, nobles guarded privilege, and the law guarded both. France appeared ordered, stratified, immovable. Yet beneath the marble of Versailles lay exhaustion, endless wars, mounting debt, religious persecution, a society disciplined by hierarchy but strained by contradiction. It was an age certain of its authority and uneasy in its conscience. François Marie Arouet entered this world in 1694, the son of a Paris notary, educated by Jesuits, formed in Latin eloquence and classical irony. Nothing in his birth suggested revolution. He was not a peasant rebel, not a provincial mystic, not a general or minister. He possessed no army, no parish, no title. What he had was language, precise, agile, amused, and dangerous. In a century where theology commanded obedience and monarchy commanded loyalty, wit would become a weapon sharper than steel. The France of his youth was not yet the France of barricades. It was a society where satire could land a man in prison, where books crossed borders in secret, where censorship operated as a form of public hygiene. The Bastille did not merely confine bodies, it reminded minds of their limits. To mock a noble was imprudent. To mock the church was perilous. To question the structure of authority was to risk erasure. And yet the very rigidity of this order created pressure. When institutions grow certain of themselves, they grow thin-skinned. By his early 20s, Arouet would taste confinement. By his 30s, he would know exile. By middle age, he would dine with kings and quarrel with them. He would flee France, return to it, flee again, and finally construct a life on its borders, not as a fugitive, but as a strategist. If he could not command the throne, he would influence those who did. If he could not silence priests, he would ridicule them. If he could not reform courts directly, he would expose their injustices to a reading public increasingly capable of indignation. But the story is larger than one restless intellect. The 18th century was beginning to move. Across the Channel, England had executed a king and settled into constitutional compromise. Commerce was expanding. Coffeehouses were becoming parliaments of conversation. Newspapers were circulating ideas faster than censors could intercept them. Science was undermining inherited cosmologies. Empires were colliding on distant shores. The Lisbon earthquake would soon shake not only a city, but the theological confidence of Europe itself. In such a climate, doubt ceased to be a private hesitation and became a public force. Voltaire, a name Arouet would adopt as both shield and persona, would stand at the crossroads of these pressures. His pen would move between courts and prisons, salons and border towns, theology and finance, philosophy and scandal. He would defend Protestants in Catholic France, admire English toleration while mocking English politics, flatter Frederick of Prussia, and then flee his court in disillusion. He would attack superstition, yet believe in a watchmaker god, despise mobs, yet weaken the legitimacy of their masters. He was not a revolutionary in the modern sense. He did not call for democracy, but he taught a generation to laugh at what had once demanded reverence. The question that hangs over his life is not merely what he wrote, but what changed because he wrote it. How does a man without office erode the certainty of offices? How does satire, which appears light, shift the moral weight of a civilization? And how does exile, forced removal from power, become a position from which power can be judged more clearly? By the time he returned to Paris in 1778, after decades away, he would be greeted not as a criminal or nuisance, but as a monument. The same society that had once confined him would now celebrate him. The transformation was not solely his, it was France's. The age that had imprisoned wit would end by applauding it. And between those two moments lies a story of thrones, altars, coffeehouses, censorship, earthquakes, judicial murders, royal patronage, and the slow moral rebalancing of Europe. To understand Voltaire is to watch an era lose its unquestioned voice and acquire a restless one in its place. The court still stands, the church still speaks, the king still rules, but something has entered the bloodstream of Europe that cannot be withdrawn. It is subtle at first. It smiles. It mocks. It asks for evidence. And it does not forget. The conditions are set. Authority remains formidable. Doubt is gathering. And a man who has already tested the walls of the Bastille is preparing to test the walls of an age. Paris, when Voltaire was young, was not a city of revolutions, but a city of permissions. Your birth placed you on a ladder. Your clothes announced your rung. Your words could lift you or ruin you. The monarchy claimed to be absolute, yet it was not a single will so much as a whole architecture of privilege. The king's authority sat at the top like a painted ceiling, but the building beneath it was crowded with competing rooms, courtiers seeking favor, bishops guarding doctrine, magistrates defending their prerogatives, financiers lending to a state that could not balance its books, and a rising class of educated men who owned no land but carried ideas like contraband. That state debt was not an accounting detail. It was the background music of the century. Louis XIV had poured men and money into war as if the treasury were an inexhaustible spring. When the war banners came down, the bills remained. France had grandeur, and it had hunger, and it had the quiet resentment that grows whenever people are asked to admire what they cannot share. Voltaire's childhood was spent in the late twilight of the Sun King, when Versailles still dictated fashion and language, and when Catholic orthodoxy was enforced with a steady hand. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes had already driven many Protestants into exile. That single act, meant to purify the kingdom, also exported talent. It sent merchants, craftsmen, and skilled minds into Holland, England, and Prussia. France kept its unity and lost some of its usefulness, a bargain monarchs often make without noticing the receipt. At the Jesuit college where Arouet studied, discipline was paired with brilliance. The Jesuits trained memory like a muscle, rhetoric like a sword, and confidence like a habit. They could make a boy speak Latin as if it were a mother tongue and argue both sides of a question with a professional smile. The Church in France was not merely a religion, it was an institution intertwined with law, education, and social rank. A clever mind could learn to move within it, even if that mind secretly enjoyed pushing against its walls. He learned early the pleasure of applause. Paris, in those years, was a theater in more than one sense. Plays mattered because public speech was otherwise constrained. The stage allowed truths to be spoken under the mask of fiction. The court loved tragedy because it loved order. Each character stayed in their role. Each passion was displayed in controlled grandeur. Each catastrophe was made beautiful by verse. Yet comedy, satire, the sly, raised eyebrow, carried a different kind of power. It could puncture without proposing an alternative. It could leave authority standing, but slightly embarrassed, and embarrassment is the beginning of doubt. When Louis XIV died in 1715, the great sun went out and the palace lights still glittered, as if refusing to admit the darkness. The heir was a child. Government passed into the hands of Philippe d'Orléans as regent, and the tone of the kingdom loosened almost overnight. The court's piety thinned, its pleasures grew franker, its moral certainty became negotiable. This was not liberation, it was a change of atmosphere. People inhaled differently. They spoke a little more freely, gambled a little more openly, mocked a little more boldly. It was in this Regency Paris that Arouet, still young, began to haunt salons and drawing rooms where the real currency was not coin, but conversation. Here, aristocrats gathered not simply to be entertained, but to be seen as capable of being entertained by cleverness. A man without a title could be admitted if he could supply brilliance on demand. Such rooms were ladders made of wit, and ladders made of wit are also traps. One slip, one insult misjudged, and the fall is long. France's aristocracy in this era could be both refined and casually brutal. It believed itself the natural ornament of the state, and it treated lesser births as a kind of impudence. A sharp tongue could amuse a noble, but it could also provoke the noble's need to remind the world who had the right to be offended. The law itself was not impartial in the modern sense. Justice in France was a mixture of custom, privilege, royal authority, and local power. The crown could issue a letter that sent a man to prison without a public trial. That practice was defended as order. It was experienced as fear. Arouet's first collision with that system was almost predictable. He wrote verses, he circulated them, and he did what young men do when they learn they can be clever. He became careless. A satirical poem or a remark that hinted too plainly at politics floated through Paris like perfume, and then like smoke. The authorities did not always need proof. Suspicion was enough when the state's dignity felt threatened. In 1717, at the age of 23, he was sent to the Bastille. The Bastille, in the popular imagination, would later become a symbol of tyranny, but in Voltaire's time it was also something more banal, a bureaucratic instrument of control. Not every prisoner there was a martyr. Some were nuisances, some were inconvenient witnesses, some were troublemakers, whom the state preferred to store rather than argue with. The building itself did not need to torture, it only needed to remove a man from the social world that gave him oxygen. Arouet arrived behind its walls as a writer with promise, and left as a writer with a lesson. The lesson was not simply that power could punish. It was that power was also absurdly sensitive. A kingdom that ruled millions could be unsettled by a few lines of verse. That realization is intoxicating. It tells a writer that the pen does not merely describe the world, it can sting it. He did not waste the confinement. He wrote, "If the state intended silence, it had chosen the wrong kind of prisoner." His tragedy Oedipe took shape, and when he returned to Paris and it was staged, it made him famous. Fame in France was a strange thing, half glory and half hazard. To be celebrated was to be noticed, and to be noticed was to be vulnerable. But it also meant access. Doors opened. People invited him to their tables. They wanted the sensation of being near a mind that could produce lines others repeated. It was around this time that he began to use the name Voltaire. Names in France were signals of lineage, but a chosen name was something else, a declaration of self-creation. In a society that insisted identity was inherited, he insisted identity could be written. He moved through Paris with the quick confidence of a man who had discovered that language could buy him entry. Yet the city he charmed was still governed by rank. A noble might enjoy Voltaire's company and still despise his presumption. Voltaire, for his part, could mock aristocrats with a precision that made them laugh until it made them angry. The confrontation that changed his life came not from a philosophical dispute, but from an insult that carried the weight of class. The Chevalier de Rohan, a young noble of ancient family, encountered Voltaire in society and chose to remind him of the difference between brilliance and birth. The story, retold in various forms, ends with an exchange. Rohan asking the writer's name, and Voltaire replying with a line that implied he was creating his own. The exact words matter less than the point. Voltaire spoke as if wit could stand equal to pedigree. Rohan, hearing this, responded not with argument, but with violence. Voltaire was beaten by Rohan's men. In a more equal society, such an assault would be a crime. In Voltaire's France, it was a message. When Voltaire sought satisfaction, the state did not punish the noble. It punished the troublesome writer. He was sent again to the Bastille, not because he had broken the peace, but because he had insisted that the peace should include him. Then came the offer disguised as mercy, exile. England was across the Channel, and to a Frenchman raised within Catholic absolutism, it was a strange laboratory. It had executed a king less than a century before. It had a parliament that mattered. It tolerated multiple Protestant sects, and even in limited ways permitted unbelief to speak. It had a press that could be scurrilous and free. It had money moving through markets with a speed that made French finance look archaic. Voltaire crossed into England in 1726, carrying bruises in his memory and curiosity in his mind. He arrived in London at a time when the city was becoming the capital of a different modernity. The streets were loud, the commerce dense, the air thick with coal smoke and ambition. England did not have Versailles' polish, but it had something that, to Voltaire, felt like a kind of strength. Institutions that did not pretend to be sacred. In France, the king's authority was wrapped in theology. In England, the monarchy had been reduced by history into something more practical. The crown still mattered, but it was checked by Parliament, and Parliament itself was an arena of interests and arguments. It was not a realm of saints. It was a realm of men bargaining over power in public. For Voltaire, raised on the spectacle of royal certainty, it was a revelation to see authority forced to justify itself. He visited coffeehouses where merchants, writers, and politicians argued as if argument were a civic duty. He witnessed how newspapers carried debate into ordinary life. He encountered philosophers whose names would become the furniture of modern thought. He read Locke. He saw Newton's influence not as a scholastic curiosity, but as a cultural authority. Newton had died only recently, and England treated him almost as France treated its saints, honored, quoted, and placed at the center of its intellectual pride. Science in this era was not merely a collection of facts. It was an alternative source of legitimacy. If the universe could be described by laws that did not require constant divine intervention, then human institutions, too, could be evaluated by reason rather than tradition. Voltaire did not become a scientist, but he understood the political implications of the scientific spirit. It trained the mind to ask for evidence, to doubt inherited explanation, and to prefer demonstration over decree. He also observed English religious life with a mixture of admiration and amusement. Toleration in England was not pure, and Catholics were still marginalized, yet the variety itself was instructive. In France, the state insisted on one true church as a pillar of unity. In England, multiple sects existed without the kingdom dissolving into chaos. That single fact undermined a powerful French assumption that religious uniformity was necessary for political order. Voltaire's genius was not that he invented these observations, but that he could turn them into prose that traveled. He began to form the book that would become his Letters concerning the English nation, later known in French as the Philosophical Letters. The letters were not private correspondence. They were a method, a literary disguise that allowed him to compare societies while pretending merely to report. He described England's institutions, its scientific culture, its commerce, its religious pluralism, and by describing, he judged France. When Voltaire returned to France in 1729, he was not returning as the same man who had been exiled. He returned with England inside him like a foreign element. France, for all its refinement, now seemed to him heavy with unnecessary chains. Its censorship looked less like moral guardianship and more like insecurity. Its religious persecution looked less like piety and more like cruelty. Its aristocracy looked less like elegance and more like a hereditary arrogance that had never been forced to defend itself. Yet he also returned to a state still burdened by debt, still seeking money, still capable of strange improvisations. France's financial system was a recurring fever. There had already been the disastrous experiment of John Law and the Mississippi scheme under the Regent, a moment when paper promises swelled like a bubble and then collapsed, ruining many and teaching the nation to distrust financial innovation. The Crown still needed funds, and it still reached for methods that would have been comic if they were not so consequential. Voltaire, always attentive to the practical side of life, found himself in the orbit of such improvisations. In 1729, he and the mathematician Charles Marie de la Condamine noticed a flaw in a state lottery tied to government bonds. The state, in its desperation, had designed a game that could be beaten by arithmetic. Voltaire participated in the scheme, and with careful calculation and coordination, he won enough to secure a level of financial independence that would later prove as important to his freedom as any philosophical insight. That money is not a trivial detail. A writer dependent on patrons is a writer whose courage must negotiate with gratitude. Voltaire's later boldness, his ability to live outside Paris, to publish, to bribe, to flee when necessary, would be sustained by the simple fact that he could afford to be inconvenient. He learned early that liberty is not merely a principle, it is an income. Now he wrote with increasing speed and range, plays, poems, essays, histories. He was building a public self, and his public self was sharpening into something Europe had not quite seen before, a man who treated ideas as events and used literature as a lever against institutions. The philosophical letters appeared in 1734, and France reacted as if a disease had entered through the border. The book compared England and France, and comparison itself was the threat. A monarchy can tolerate praise, even flattery, because praise confirms its place. It struggles with the idea that it might be one political arrangement among others. The letters implied that the French system was not inevitable. It was merely habitual. The authorities condemned the book. Copies were seized. The work was burned by the hangman, a ritual meant to show that a book could be executed like a criminal. The gesture revealed the anxiety beneath the state's confidence. France could defeat armies, but it feared pages. Voltaire was warned. He fled Paris. In France, flight was often the sensible response of a man who understood that the state's patience was not a right, but a mood. He did not flee like a man abandoning a cause. He fled like a man keeping his cause alive. He found refuge in Champagne at the estate of Émilie du Châtelet, a woman of aristocratic rank and astonishing intellect. Their partnership would become one of the most productive and strange alliances of the century, a brilliant mathematician and physicist who also lived as a noblewoman and a writer whose mind burned to remake culture, but whose body still needed shelter from the police. The chateau at Cirey, in the rural quiet of northeastern France, became an outpost of the Enlightenment before the Enlightenment had fully become an era. It was not a university, not a court, not a monastery. It was a private laboratory of thought. They renovated the chateau, built a library, installed instruments, and filled the rooms with books, correspondence, and conversation. In that place, away from Paris's surveillance, Voltaire could write with a steadier hand. Satire also reveals something essential about the age. The new ideas of reason and science did not spread first through popular assemblies. They spread through elite spaces, salons, private estates, networks of correspondence. The Enlightenment was not born in the street. It was born in rooms where people had leisure, education, and the means to acquire forbidden books. Its early champions were often aristocrats and wealthy intellectuals who could afford the risks. Yet the risks remained real. The church and state still controlled official printing. Books that challenged doctrine or authority were often published abroad, smuggled back into France, sold under the counter. The book trade became a shadow economy of ideas. The very act of reading could become a quiet defiance. Voltaire at Satire wrote not as a hermit, but as a man in the center of a growing European conversation. Letters crossed borders, manuscripts traveled, royal courts watched one another. Philosophers, scientists, and writers formed a republic that had no territory but had influence. Its citizens were bound not by law, but by curiosity and mutual recognition. It was here, under Émily's influence, that Voltaire deepened his engagement with Newtonian science. Émily would translate Newton's Principia into French, an extraordinary feat that helped bring Newton's work into the French intellectual bloodstream. Voltaire, for his part, wrote popular expositions of Newton's ideas, turning complex physics into prose that educated and persuaded. This was not merely an intellectual service. It was a cultural strategy. If Newton's universe could be accepted, then the intellectual authority of scholastic theology would weaken further. The cosmos itself would become less enchanted, and a less enchanted cosmos makes room for different forms of political imagination. But Voltaire was never content to be a lecturer. He wanted to strike. He wrote plays that could be staged and thus carried to public attention. He wrote histories that treated the past not as sacred legend, but as the record of human choices. He wrote poetry that could flatter or sting. He wrote essays that attacked superstition with a speed that made his enemies feel as if they were being swarmed. He also learned to speak to power rather than merely about it. The monarchy of Louis XV, which followed the Regency, was different from Louis XIV's. Louis XV was not a son demanding worship. He was a man of appetite and fatigue, often distant from governance, while ministers, courtiers, and mistresses shaped policy and patronage. The state's machinery continued, but the aura of grandeur dimmed. In such a climate, influence did not always flow through formal office. It flowed through networks, favors, and the shifting, intimate politics of court. Voltaire wanted acceptance. He wanted the protections that came with being recognized as an official man of letters. Yet he did not want to be tamed. He lived in a constant negotiation between the desire to be safe and the desire to be dangerous, and that negotiation itself became a source of energy. In the 1740s, Europe descended again into war. The War of the Austrian Succession was, on the surface, a dispute over a crown. Beneath the surface, it was the familiar contest of dynasties and empires. France fought not for a principle, but for advantage. Armies marched, alliances shifted, and the continent once more revealed its habit. It could turn human lives into counters on a diplomatic table with ease. Voltaire watched this not as a soldier, but as a historian in training, seeing how rulers spoke of honor while calculating territory. He began to write history with a new ambition. Traditional history, in the service of monarchies, had often been a chronicle of kings, battles, and treaties, as if humanity consisted only of those who wore crowns. Voltaire wanted something broader, the history of manners, commerce, arts, and ideas. He wanted to describe civilizations as living organisms, not merely as thrones passing from father to son. This, too, was subversive because it implied that the greatness of a nation was not the personal property of its rulers. His The Age of Louis XIV was not an attack on the Sun King so much as an attempt to measure what a reign produced in culture. It praised splendor and condemned fanaticism. It treated religion and politics as forces within human history, rather than as absolute truths outside it. Voltaire's histories were weapons wrapped in silk. They could be admired for style while smuggling in a new way of judging the past. He was also, in a very human way, hungry for recognition. The French Academy represented the official consecration of a writer. To be admitted was to be declared safe enough to be honored. Voltaire, long scandalous, long exiled, long watched, wanted that laurel. In 1746, he achieved it. The moment mattered not only for his vanity, but for his position. It suggested that France could not fully resist him. It might punish him, burn his books, threaten him, yet it also needed him as a symbol of French brilliance. He had become too famous to discard without embarrassment. Yet, even as his status rose, his security remained fragile. The French state could be generous one day and severe the next, because it was governed by moods and factions. A bishop could denounce him. A minister could protect him. A court intrigue could shift the ground beneath his feet. The old order, for all its pomp, was unstable in its own way. It depended on personal influence as much as on law. The relationship at Cirey also evolved. Voltaire and Émilie were partners in mind and work, but they were not saints. Their household was an arrangement of love, ambition, jealousy, and intellectual pursuit. Émilie's own desires did not always align with Voltaire's. She could be both devoted and independent, and Voltaire, who understood human weakness with merciless clarity, could still be wounded by it. Their world was also one in which aristocratic women could play a significant role in intellectual life, yet always within constraints. Salons were often hosted by women who curated conversation and built networks. Patronage could flow through them, yet formal power remained male, and a woman's freedom was always conditional on rank, marriage, or scandal. Émilie's brilliance was extraordinary, but she still lived within a social order that treated her intellect as an ornament, as much as a force. Voltaire's writing during these years carried both the glow and the bitterness of this arrangement. He was productive, protected, and yet always aware that his protection depended on circumstances beyond his control. He could feel both gratitude and humiliation in the same breath. One of the sharpest tests of his temperament came from across Europe, in Prussia. Frederick, Crown Prince of Prussia, and later Frederick the Great, was a soldier in training with a philosopher's vanity. He read French literature, wrote in French, and cultivated the image of a modern ruler who loved reason. He corresponded with Voltaire, flattering him, seeking his approval, inviting him into a friendship that promised something intoxicating, the union of intellect and power. Voltaire, who had tasted the brutality of French aristocrats and the suspicion of French authorities, was intrigued by the possibility of a monarch who might protect thinkers rather than imprison them. The correspondence between Voltaire and Frederick was itself a product of the age. Monarchs were beginning to understand that reputation mattered not only among nobles, but among intellectuals. To be seen as enlightened was to possess a new kind of legitimacy. Philosophers, in turn, were tempted by proximity to power, because power could provide safety, printing privileges, pensions, and influence. The relationship between thinkers and rulers became a dance of mutual exploitation. The philosopher wanted protection. The king wanted prestige. For now, Voltaire remained in France, but Frederick's letters were like a distant trumpet calling. They suggested that Voltaire's life might yet move from being tolerated to being embraced by a state that sought his brilliance. Then, in 1749, the ground under Voltaire's world gave way. Émilie du Châtelet became pregnant by the poet Saint-Lambert. The pregnancy, at her age, was dangerous. The household that had functioned as a laboratory of thought became a place of tension and fear. Voltaire, who had long depended on Émilie for intellectual companionship and for shelter, found himself facing the possibility of losing both. Émilie died in childbirth. With her death, Voltaire lost not merely a lover and a friend, but the center of gravity that had steadied him for 15 years. Cirey had been a fortress of reason in a kingdom that could be irrational. It had been a place where he could write without looking over his shoulder every hour. Now that fortress was gone. Grief is often portrayed as silence, but for Voltaire it was also movement. He was a man who could not remain still inside pain. The loss made France feel colder and Paris more dangerous. His enemies were still there. The censors were still there. The aristocratic contempt that had once beaten him was still part of the air. Without Émilie's sanctuary, he was again exposed. Frederick's invitation grew louder. Prussia offered the promise of patronage. It offered a court where a writer might be celebrated rather than merely tolerated. It offered, at least in imagination, the possibility that reason might sit beside power as an advisor rather than as a suspect. Voltaire prepared to leave France not as a triumphant envoy, but as a man carrying both ambition and exhaustion. He had learned the anatomy of French authority, its vanity, its sensitivity, its capacity for sudden punishment. He had learned that satire could wound, but it could also provoke retaliation. He had learned that ideas needed networks, money, and refuge if they were to survive. And he had learned something deeper still, something the century itself was learning in slow and uneven steps. That power is not only the throne and the altar, it is also the court of opinion, the circulation of books, the authority of science, the prestige of reason, and the quiet contempt that grows in a population when the old certainties begin to look like costumes. He was leaving behind a France that still believed itself ordered, but that was already in its mind becoming less obedient. He was leaving behind a culture that could burn books, yet could not prevent those books from being desired. He was leaving behind institutions that claimed eternity, yet were beginning to feel the pressure of time. Across the border waited a king who wrote verses and commanded armies, a ruler who claimed to admire philosophy. In the summer of 1750, Voltaire crossed into a different kind of kingdom. France had taught him the habits of a court that smiled while sharpening its knives. England had shown him a public life where argument could breathe. Now Prussia offered a third experiment, a state built like a barracks, governed by a king who read philosophy at night and drilled soldiers by day, and who had decided that the modern world would not forgive a ruler who seemed merely brutal. Frederick II wanted to be feared in war and admired in peace. He wanted his bayonets to hold territory, and his letters to hold reputation. Prussia was not Paris. It had little of France's ease and none of its languid confidence. It was a young power with a thin aristocracy, a small population, and an economy always measuring itself against stronger neighbors. Its strength came from discipline and administration, from the grim efficiency of a state that could not afford improvisation. Frederick had inherited that machine and then risked everything on ambition, snatching Silesia from Austria and daring Europe to take it back. His victories had made him famous. His audacity had made him vulnerable. A king in such a position is always listening for contempt. He does not merely want praise. He wants homage from the kinds of minds that give praise meaning. Voltaire arrived in Potsdam as a guest and as a trophy. Frederick received him with warmth that had calculation behind it. At table, the king spoke French as if he were doing Europe a favor by not speaking German. He joked, he quoted, he flattered, and he kept his court close enough to watch their reactions. Here was the enlightened monarch in his preferred costume, soldier and sage, practical ruler and philosophical friend. Voltaire, who had been beaten by nobles and hunted by censors, tasted the sweetness of being wanted by a sovereign rather than merely tolerated. But a court is never simply a gathering of minds. It is a system of loyalties, jealousies, ambitions, and small cruelties. Frederick's court glittered with intelligence in the way a blade glitters, sharp, cold, and useful. Men competed for access to the king's attention. Scholars competed for prestige in the academy. Officers competed for promotion. Every compliment had a shadow of fear behind it, because Frederick could be generous and he could be merciless, and he liked both modes of power. He mocked in public. He rewarded in private. He made men feel seen, then made them feel replaceable. Voltaire was given honors, appointments, and a pension. He was asked to revise Frederick's poems, to polish the king's French like a court jeweler polishing gems. He was lodged, dined, admired, displayed. Yet from the beginning he sensed the danger of this arrangement. To be attached to a king is to be pulled into the king's gravity. The philosopher becomes a decoration, and decoration is a kind of captivity. Frederick wanted Voltaire's mind, but he wanted it in a position he could command. The Prussian Academy of Sciences was meant to be the temple of Frederick's reason. Its president, Pierre-Louis Moreau de Maupeou, was a man of scientific talent and restless vanity. He had helped establish Newton's reputation on the continent and had led an expedition to Lapland to measure the shape of the earth, turning abstract physics into heroic adventure. Frederick admired him, and Maupertuis, like many men who have tasted admiration, grew hungry for more. He demanded deference. He collected enemies. In an institution where prestige was the only currency, he spent it loudly. Voltaire watched these academic quarrels with the amused contempt of a man who had survived prisons and censors. To him, the squabbles of scholars could look like the vanity of generals without the danger. But he also knew that vanity, in any form, can become lethal when it sits near power. Maupertuis and his rivals turned scientific disputes into questions of honor, and questions of honor into court politics. The Academy was not a quiet haven of reason. It was a miniature Versailles with Latin footnotes. Voltaire's instinct was always toward satire, because satire allowed him to win without appearing to fight. He could reduce a man's dignity to a joke, and a joke travels faster than an argument. When a dispute erupted around Maupertuis, Voltaire began to write with the kind of cruelty that looks effortless. He produced a pamphlet that mocked the Academy's president with surgical precision, turning the man's pretensions into a spectacle. It was witty. It was vicious. It was also a mistake in a court where the king's favor was the only true shield. Frederick, who enjoyed cruelty when it was his own, did not enjoy being embarrassed through his chosen instruments. Maupertuis was his appointment. To mock Maupertuis was to suggest Frederick had crowned a fool. Frederick's reaction was swift and theatrical. The pamphlet was condemned. Copies were burned. The enlightened court performed a ritual of censorship with the same fire that French authorities had used against Voltaire's books. The scene was instructive. Even in Prussia, reason had boundaries marked by royal pride. In that moment, Voltaire understood the truth about enlightened absolutism. The king might permit free thought, but only insofar as it remained decorative. The king could admire skepticism, provided it did not become insolence. He could invite philosophers to his table, provided they did not forget who owned the table. Enlightenment at court was a lamp on a chain. It gives light, but it does not move freely. Voltaire's relationship with Frederick cooled. The banter sharpened into barbs. The friendship, which had been conducted partly through letters full of compliments and philosophical play, was now contaminated by resentment. Voltaire had expected a refuge. He found another kind of cage, lined with velvet and guarded by wit. He tried to leave Prussia, and leaving a king is always harder than arriving. Frederick did not like to be abandoned, especially not by a figure whose presence had become part of his public identity. Voltaire's departure turned into a humiliation. In Frankfurt, Prussian agents detained him, searched his belongings, and demanded he surrender a volume of Frederick's poems and letters that the king feared might be used against him. Voltaire, who had thought himself a guest, was treated like a suspect. The episode was a reminder delivered in the language of force. The philosopher may sting, but the state can still seize. When he finally slipped away, shaken and furious, he carried with him a new clarity. Monarchs could be patrons, but they were never partners. They could enjoy a philosopher's praise, but they could not tolerate a philosopher's independence. Frederick's court had taught Voltaire what France had taught him in harsher terms. Power admires intelligence the way a hunter admires a fine animal. It wants it near, and it wants it contained. He went first toward Switzerland, toward the borderlands where jurisdictions blurred and censorship weakened. Geneva, austere and Calvinist, was not a city of glittering courts. It was a republic of merchants and ministers, proud of its discipline and its moral seriousness. Its freedom was real, but it was not permissive. It had exchanged royal absolutism for civic constraint, and its constraint was enforced by religion and communal vigilance. Voltaire, who had spent his life fighting Catholic intolerance, now found himself living among Protestants who had their own forms of severity. At first, Geneva offered him the simplest of gifts, safety. Its magistrates were not eager to offend France by harboring troublemakers, but Swiss independence gave them room to be polite and non-committal. Voltaire purchased an estate nearby, a place he called Les Délices, and began again the life he had perfected, writing, corresponding, hosting visitors, and watching Europe as if it were a stage where kings strutted and priests thundered while ordinary people paid the price. Yet even in Geneva, he discovered that the Enlightenment did not always mean comfort. The city's ministers frowned on theater. They feared it as a school of vanity and moral looseness. Voltaire, who believed drama was one of the few ways public speech could become art, could not resist provoking them. He staged plays. He entertained. He offended. Geneva, which he had imagined as a refuge of liberty, revealed itself as a refuge of a different doctrine. The 18th century was full of such ironies. Every society that declared itself rational still obeyed some sacred boundary. France obeyed monarchy and Catholicism. Prussia obeyed the king's pride and the army's discipline. Geneva obeyed Calvinist austerity and civic conformity. Voltaire's life became a tour of Europe's limits, and his genius lay in testing those limits until they revealed their hypocrisies. In 1755, while he was living near Geneva, Europe was struck by an event that felt less like news and more like judgment. On the morning of November 1st, Lisbon shook. The ground convulsed, buildings collapsed, fires erupted, and the sea surged inward. Tens of thousands died. The capital of a Catholic empire was wrecked on a holy day. In an age that still read disasters as messages from heaven, the question arrived with the force of the earthquake itself. What kind of providence governs a world where the devout are crushed under their churches? The Lisbon disaster did something rare. It made metaphysics urgent. Philosophers had argued for centuries about the nature of evil, the justice of God, the meaning of suffering. Now a city lay in ruins, and the dead were not abstract. They were bodies in streets, families burned, children drowned, prayers interrupted by falling stone. The old consolations sounded thinner when confronted with the smell of smoke and salt water. Voltaire responded as a man whose mind could not accept pious evasion. He wrote a poem that refused the comfortable idea that everything happens for the best. The Enlightenment had often been accused of coldness, but Voltaire's anger was not cold. It was a moral heat directed at the laziness of explanation. He could accept that nature is indifferent. He could accept that human cruelty exists. What he could not accept was a philosophy that turned suffering into a decorative proof of hidden harmony. This placed him in conflict not only with theologians, but with a certain strain of philosophical optimism, the notion that the universe, in its total design, must be the best possible arrangement. Such optimism had comforted elites because it allowed them to see order behind disorder and meaning behind pain. Lisbon made that posture look obscene. Yet the age's response was not unified. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, younger than Voltaire and shaped by different wounds, wrote back with a rebuke. Rousseau argued that humans themselves magnify disaster by building crowded cities and living artificial lives. He suggested that the earthquake was not an indictment of providence, so much as an indictment of civilization. Voltaire saw this as evasive, almost cruel in its own way, because it turned the dead into an argument against urban life rather than a question about justice. That exchange revealed a fault line inside the Enlightenment itself. Voltaire's reason was social and civic. He wanted reform, toleration, and the restraint of institutions. Rousseau's reason was inward and moral. He wanted authenticity, a return to nature, a kind of spiritual cleansing. Voltaire mocked Rousseau as sentimental and dangerous. Rousseau saw Voltaire as brilliant and corrupt. The 18th century was not one choir singing the praises of reason. It was a crowded room of quarrels where different visions of human improvement competed for dominance. Out of Lisbon and out of this conflict over optimism, Voltaire produced a work that would become one of the century's most enduring arrows. Candide appeared in 1759, slim enough to be smuggled easily and sharp enough to cut deep. It was a tale of a young man taught by a philosopher that everything is for the best, then flung into a world determined to refute that teaching through war, persecution, greed, and disaster. Candide moved through Europe and beyond like a fever dream of the 18th century's realities. Battles fought for dynastic pride, villages burned, women violated, men executed by courts with clean procedures and dirty consciences. He encountered the Inquisition, which punished heresy with ceremony. He encountered colonial violence, slavery, and the casual brutality of empires that spoke of civilization while profiting from chains. Voltaire did not write the book as a historian, yet in its exaggerations it contained the truth of systems. It showed how easily ideology becomes cruelty when it needs victims to prove itself. The book's power came not only from its satire, but from its refusal to offer a grand substitute. It did not replace optimism with despair. It replaced it with modesty. In the end, after the whirl of catastrophe, the surviving characters retreat to a small plot of land and adopt the simple discipline of work. The lesson is not that justice reigns. It is that humans must carve out a space of decency in a universe that does not promise it. In an age intoxicated with theories, the book ended by praising the stubborn virtues of the ordinary. Candide was also Voltaire's revenge on metaphysics. Philosophical systems, to him, were often elaborate excuses for ignoring suffering. He preferred a morality that begins with facts. People bleed, courts err, priests persecute, kings gamble with lives. If philosophy cannot confront these realities without turning them into ornaments of a cosmic plan, then philosophy is a luxury and perhaps a vice. The 1750s also brought war on a scale that made moral talk feel fragile. The 7 Years' War began in 1756 and spread across continents like fire in dry timber. In Europe, it was a conflict of alliances and dynasties. In North America, it was a struggle between Britain and France for empire. In India, it was another chapter in the contest between trading companies that had become quasi-states. It was one of the first wars that could plausibly be called global, because its battles, its money, and its consequences circled the earth. Frederick's Prussia was nearly crushed. Austria sought revenge for Silesia. Russia advanced. France and Sweden joined the pressure. Prussia survived through Frederick's brutal energy and through accidents of diplomacy, including the sudden change of Russian policy when a new ruler admired Frederick. The war demonstrated how precarious states were and how dependent their survival could be on chance, personality, and the shifting passions of courts. France, meanwhile, lost much of its overseas empire. British naval power strangled French trade. Colonies fell. The Crown's finances deteriorated further. The war did not create France's fiscal crisis, but it deepened it. And it deepened also the sense that the monarchy's grandeur was becoming too expensive for its own population. A state that cannot pay its bills begins to lose moral authority, because it must ask the public to sacrifice while the court continues to indulge. Voltaire watched this carnage from his border refuge with the bitter perspective of a man who had dined with kings and seen how lightly they could speak of suffering when maps lay on the table. His letters from these years drip with contempt for war's absurdity, yet his contempt was not pacifism in the modern sense. He did not imagine that humans could be purified of violence through rhetoric alone. He imagined, rather, that institutions could be restrained, that fanaticism could be mocked into shame, and that the worst cruelties could be exposed to public hatred. He moved in 1758 into the place that would become the final stage of his long campaign. Ferney lay near the Swiss border, close enough to Geneva for printing and escape, and close enough to France for influence. It sat in that zone where sovereignty becomes porous, where authorities must negotiate because the line between jurisdictions is also a line between permissions. Voltaire purchased the estate and transformed it. He rebuilt the manor, improved the land, and developed local industry. He encouraged watchmaking, a craft that appealed to the Enlightenment mind because it demanded precision and patience. Ferney became not merely a home, but a base, a private state of letters. The irony was delicious and instructive. The man who mocked aristocratic privilege became a local lord. He was addressed with the titles of seigneurial respect. Peasants depended on his decisions. He collected rents. He managed estates. Yet he used this position with a purpose that went beyond comfort. Ferney gave him independence and leverage. He could host visitors from across Europe. He could print and distribute works through a network that had learned to evade censors. He could shelter persecuted people. He could conduct campaigns like a general, using paper and reputation rather than troops. From Ferney, he became, in effect, Europe's most influential private citizen. His correspondence was enormous. Letters arrived from ministers, nobles, writers, scientists, and strangers seeking justice. He answered with the energy of a man who believed that words can move the world, provided they are aimed with accuracy. He understood public opinion as a force that could discipline institutions without needing to overthrow them. He could not command a court, but he could embarrass it. He could not reverse a verdict directly, but he could make the verdict stink. This power of embarrassment became crucial in the case that turned Voltaire from satirist to crusader. In 1762, in Toulouse, a Protestant merchant named Jean Calas was accused of murdering his son to prevent the boy's conversion to Catholicism. Toulouse was a city where religious memory had not cooled. Protestantism there was still associated with heresy, rebellion, and hidden danger. The legal system, staffed by magistrates who were also local elites, could be both formal and vengeful. Trials were conducted with procedures that appeared orderly, yet the spirit behind them could be fevered. Calas was arrested, interrogated, and tortured. Under torture, he denied the crime. He was condemned anyway and executed, broken on the wheel, a death that was both punishment and spectacle. The state's cruelty was not merely physical, it was symbolic. It was meant to reassure the Catholic majority that heresy could still be crushed. Voltaire first approached the case with suspicion. He had absorbed, like many Frenchmen, the reflexive distrust of Protestants cultivated by decades of persecution and propaganda. But as he examined the evidence and as he corresponded with those connected to the family, his mind shifted. He saw the familiar pattern, a society eager for a moral narrative, a court eager to display zeal, and a victim too weak to resist. The case became, for him, a test of whether France could claim justice while practicing vengeance. What made the Calas affair different from countless other injustices was Voltaire's decision to treat it as a matter of public conscience rather than local procedure. He began to write. He wrote letters to influential people. He wrote pamphlets that framed the case as a scandal. He used irony, indignation, and relentless repetition. He understood that outrage must be sustained if it is to overcome the inertia of institutions. He also understood that the French monarchy, despite its absolutism, was sensitive to reputation. The crown could tolerate cruelty, but it did not like to appear ridiculous or barbaric in the eyes of Europe. Voltaire aimed at that nerve. He presented Toulouse's verdict as the product of fanaticism rather than justice. He portrayed the Calas family as ordinary and wronged. He insisted on the possibility of error, and he used that possibility like a wedge. In 1763, he published a treatise on tolerance, a work that blended argument with moral pressure. He did not write as a theologian debating doctrine. He wrote as a citizen confronting the consequences of religious certainty. He appealed to reason, but he also appealed to the reader's instinctive horror at seeing a man destroyed by a court that wanted to prove its piety. The campaign succeeded, slowly and against resistance. In 1765, the King's Council annulled the verdict and rehabilitated the Calas family. It was not merely a legal reversal, it was a cultural event. It demonstrated that public opinion, shaped by print and persuasion, could force the state to admit error. Voltaire did not abolish intolerance. He did not end the Church's power, but he proved that the old alliance between religious zeal and judicial cruelty could be weakened when exposed. This was a turning point not in his career, but in Europe's moral habits. A new kind of politics was emerging, one conducted not only through parliaments and courts, but through outrage, pamphlets, and the mobilization of sympathy. Voltaire did not invent that politics, but he mastered it. He showed that the pen could become a tool of legal reform by attacking the legitimacy of injustice. The Calas affair also revealed something darker about the Ancien Régime. Its courts were not merely corrupt in the crude sense, they were capable of sincere cruelty. The magistrates of Toulouse likely believed they were defending the faith and the social order. Fanaticism is most dangerous when it wears the face of duty. Voltaire's genius was to make that duty look shameful. He did not stop with Calas. Other cases arrived, and he treated them as symptoms of the same disease. The Servan family, also Protestant, was accused of murdering a daughter. The story carried the same odor: religious prejudice, legal pressure, a desire to produce a moral spectacle. Voltaire took up their defense as well. He corresponded, published, pressured. Over years the case shifted, and the family was eventually cleared. Each victory reinforced the idea that courts could be challenged, that verdicts were not sacred, that justice might be dragged toward decency by public scrutiny. Then came the case of the Chevalier de la Barre in 1766, a young man condemned and executed for alleged sacrilege, accused of failing to show proper reverence and of possessing irreligious writings. His death, brutal and ceremonial, exposed how religious discipline could still be enforced with blood, even as Europe congratulated itself on becoming enlightened. Voltaire's response was furious. He saw in La Barre's execution not merely a local horror, but a sign that the old alliance of altar and law still had teeth. He wrote to keep the scandal alive, to prevent the authorities from burying it under silence. His battle cry against what he called infamy was not a simple attack on faith itself. Voltaire was a deist, suspicious of atheism and contemptuous of priests. He believed in a creator, in a moral order, and in the usefulness of religion for restraining human violence. Yet he also believed that organized religion, when fused with state power, becomes a factory of cruelty. His target was fanaticism armed with law. This position made him both influential and deeply contradictory. He could defend religious minorities while also expressing contempt for certain groups in ways that reflect the prejudices of his era. He could praise toleration while mocking beliefs he found absurd. He could appear as the champion of reason while also using distortion, exaggeration, and personal malice when it served his campaigns. He was not a saint of enlightenment. He was its most effective combatant, which is a different thing. Combatants win by force of will as much as by purity. The broader intellectual world of France in these decades was also shifting under pressure. The Encyclopédie, edited by Diderot and d'Alembert, attempted something enormous: to gather human knowledge, to organize it, and to present it as a coherent structure that did not require theological permission. It was a monument of confidence, and it terrified authorities because it implied that the Church did not own truth. The state alternated between tolerating it and suppressing it, depending on which faction held influence. Voltaire admired the audacity of the project and distrusted some of its contributors. He preferred his own method: quick strikes, sharp essays, and campaigns that could be aimed like arrows rather than built like cathedrals. Rousseau, meanwhile, continued to become famous in a way that irritated Voltaire. Rousseau spoke in the language of sincerity and moral anguish. He distrusted elite society, distrusted theaters, distrusted the artificiality of salons. He argued that civilization corrupts, that inequality is born from property, that humans are born free and then bound by social chains. Voltaire saw in Rousseau a dangerous romanticism, a softness that could become fury. Rousseau saw in Voltaire a glittering cynicism, a man who mocked faith and yet lived among the comforts of privilege. Their quarrel symbolized another divergence. One branch of the Enlightenment sought to reform institutions through reason, toleration, and the refinement of law. Another branch sought to transform humanity through moral renewal, emotional authenticity, and a radical critique of society itself. Both branches criticized the old order, but they did so with different instruments, and they dreamed of different futures. The century contained both, and the French Revolution would later drink from both wells. Voltaire's own politics remained cautious. He did not trust crowds. He did not believe that ordinary people, left to themselves, would produce wisdom. He believed in elites, in educated rulers, in reforms from above. He preferred enlightened despotism to popular sovereignty. This was not because he loved tyranny, but because he feared chaos. He had seen how religious mobs could destroy. He had seen how courts could torture. He suspected that the masses, driven by hunger and rumor, could be just as cruel. His ideal was a rational order governed by intelligence and restrained by public opinion. This made his relationship with monarchs continue even as he mocked monarchy's pretensions. He corresponded with Catherine II of Russia, who cultivated the image of a modern ruler even as she expanded her empire through war and tightened control at home. Catherine admired Voltaire because he represented the kind of European prestige Russia still craved. Voltaire admired Catherine because she represented a ruler who might implement reforms. Their correspondence was full of praise and flattery on both sides, a mutual exchange of legitimacy, the philosopher lending moral sheen to power, the empress lending power's glow to philosophy. He maintained correspondence with Frederick as well, even after their rupture, because both men understood that contempt does not always end influence. Frederick needed Voltaire's reputation. Voltaire needed Frederick's attention as proof that his words still mattered to kings. Their relationship, stripped of illusion, became what it perhaps always was beneath the compliments, a contest between two forms of vanity, each using the other. At Ferney, Voltaire grew old in the peculiar way powerful writers grow old. His body weakened, but his influence expanded. Visitors came in procession, nobles seeking conversation, foreigners seeking a glimpse of the famous mind, young writers seeking blessing, victims seeking help. Ferney became a pilgrimage site of modernity. In that house near the border, the 18th century rehearsed a new arrangement: moral authority detached from office, charisma detached from bloodline, influence detached from formal rank. He also became wealthier. He managed investments, purchased properties, and treated finance as another tool of independence. The Enlightenment is often imagined as purely spiritual and intellectual, but it thrived within the practical realities of commerce and capital. Printing requires money, networks require patronage, refuge requires property. Voltaire's liberty was sustained by balance sheets as much as by principles. His critics attacked him for this, and not without reason. They pointed to his comfort, his estates, his willingness to flatter rulers, his enjoyment of status. Yet comfort does not cancel courage. It complicates it. He could be vain and still be brave. He could enjoy privilege and still fight injustice. The human heart is not tidy. The age itself was not tidy. It was a world where ideals were often carried by men and women who benefited from the very structures they criticized. As the 1770s approached, France was becoming a society of sharpened nerves. The monarchy's finances were strained. The credibility of the church had been weakened by scandal and by the slow seep of skepticism. Educated elites were reading forbidden books as if they were necessities. The gap between privilege and burden widened. The parlements, those high courts that had once served as guardians of law, were now also centers of political resistance, and the Crown's attempts to discipline them revealed weakness rather than strength. A government that must constantly wrestle with its own institutions begins to look less like a natural order and more like a contested arrangement. Voltaire, from his border estate, watched these pressures accumulate. He did not desire revolution. He desired restraint, toleration, and reform. Yet he also knew, perhaps better than most, that ridicule is a solvent. Once a society learns to laugh at what it once feared, obedience becomes harder to enforce. A throne can survive criticism, but it struggles to survive contempt. In 1778, at the age of 83, Voltaire returned to Paris for the first time in decades. The city he entered was not the same city that had sent him to prison as a young satirist. Paris had become a place where philosophers were fashionable, where skepticism had entered polite conversation, where the theater could crown an old writer like a conquering hero. He came to oversee the performance of a new play, and he came also because the human animal, even after a lifetime of battles, still hungers for the final applause. The reception he received was extraordinary. Crowds gathered. Admirers treated him as if he were not merely a man, but an era made flesh. He came to the theater like an old general returning to a city he once served and once offended, and Paris answered with a kind of civic passion that no minister could have manufactured. A bust of him was crowned with laurel. Applause rolled through the hall, not merely for a play, but for the long defiance behind it. There was an irony in the scene that would have amused him if he had been less ill. The institutions he had fought still stood. The monarchy still ruled. The church still demanded authority. Yet here was Paris, applauding a man who had spent his life exposing those institutions' hypocrisies. The celebration was a sign that France's inner posture had shifted. The old order still existed, but it no longer possessed unquestioned reverence among the educated and the fashionable. It was being endured, negotiated with, and quietly mocked. Voltaire's final weeks in Paris were marked by exhaustion and by the familiar pressure of religious authority. Priests sought his repentance. Friends sought to protect him from clerical theater. He had lived as a critic of religious coercion, and it would have been consistent for the Church to attempt to claim his soul as a public trophy. Voltaire, weak and in pain, maneuvered through these demands with the last of his cunning. He was not interested in becoming a symbol of atheism, and he was not interested in submitting to a ritual he regarded as an instrument of intimidation. He wanted, above all, to die as himself, not as a confession forced into his mouth by others. He died in May of 1778. Even his burial became a political act. Paris, under the shadow of ecclesiastical power, was not eager to grant honor to a man who had spent his life attacking clerical cruelty. His friends, fearing that the Church would deny him burial or turn his death into a spectacle of repentance, moved his body quietly out of the city. He was buried in Champagne, away from the public rituals that might have rewritten his final chapter. Yet his story did not end with his death, because in the 18th century a reputation could become a political instrument. 13 years later, in 1791, the French Revolution carried his remains to the Panthéon in Paris with immense ceremony. Crowds lined the streets. The old writer, who had been denied full honor by the Church, was now honored by a new regime that defined itself partly through the rejection of clerical authority. Voltaire had not planned this. He had not desired the kind of upheaval that would follow. But the logic of history is often indifferent to intention. A man may fight for reform and still supply ammunition for revolution. What then did he accomplish, viewed from the long perspective he himself often adopted when writing history? He did not topple the monarchy. He did not create democracy. He did not end cruelty. What he did was change the climate of judgment. He taught Europe's educated classes to demand reasons where once they accepted decrees. He taught them to suspect the moral language of institutions that inflicted suffering. He taught them to treat courts, priests, and even kings as human actors rather than as sacred categories. He made it harder for authority to hide behind mystery. He also demonstrated the power of print in a society still governed by personal influence. The 17th century had been ruled by palaces and armies. The 18th century began to discover another arena, the circulation of words. Pamphlets, plays, letters, and clandestine books formed a nervous system that could carry outrage and skepticism across borders. Voltaire became the most skilled operator of that nervous system, sending shocks into the body of the old order. His life also exposed the limits of the Enlightenment. Reason did not automatically produce kindness. Skepticism did not automatically produce humility. The same mind that can dismantle superstition can also indulge prejudice. The same pen that can defend the persecuted can also wound for pleasure. His brilliance could be generous, and it could be cruel, sometimes within the same paragraph. He believed in toleration, yet he could mock beliefs with contempt that looks, to later eyes, like intolerance of another kind. He distrusted the Church's power, yet he feared the consequences of removing religion entirely. He despised fanaticism, yet he could become fanatical in his own pursuit of victory. These contradictions were not personal quirks alone. They were the contradictions of an age trying to escape the authority of tradition without yet knowing what would replace it. The 18th century wanted freedom, but it feared disorder. It wanted truth, but it feared the implications of truth. It wanted reform, but it was built on privileges that made reform painful. His choice to live on borders was not merely practical, it was emblematic. The Enlightenment itself lived on borders, between faith and skepticism, between monarchy and public opinion, between inherited hierarchy and emerging notions of rights, between the private world of salons and the widening world of readers who could not be easily controlled. In Ferney, that border became physical. He could write under Swiss shelter and send his words into France. He could enjoy the security of property and use it to challenge courts. He could host aristocrats and mock aristocracy. He could correspond with empresses and defend peasants. He was a man inside the old world and against it at the same time, which is often the position of those who actually change the shape of a century. By the time he died, the alliance of throne and altar still stood, but it stood on ground that had begun to shift. The monarchy's finances were broken. The Church's moral authority had been weakened. The educated classes had learned new habits of criticism. The public had begun, unevenly, to taste the idea that authority might need justification. When the crisis finally arrived in 1789, it would not be created by pamphlets alone. It would be created by debt, hunger, political paralysis, and the failure of institutions to adapt. But pamphlets, ridicule, and moral campaigns had prepared minds to see those failures not as fate, but as scandal. His real achievement was not in any single book, not even in Candide or the treatise on tolerance. It was in the steady formation of a new posture toward power. He took the ancient weapon of satire and aimed it at institutions that had long been protected by fear. He took the new instrument of public opinion and showed how it could discipline courts. He took the life of a writer, once a dependent servant of patrons, and turned it into something closer to a public magistracy of the mind. He began as a young man imprisoned for a poem and beaten for an insolent remark. He ended as an old man crowned with laurel by a theatre, and later carried like a relic by a revolution. Between those 2 points lies the arc of Europe's awakening to a dangerous thought, that legitimacy is not inherited like a title. It is earned, defended, and sometimes lost. The 18th century liked to speak of progress, and Voltaire, with his sharp laugh, would have warned against easy optimism. Yet something did progress, at least in the realm that governs all others, the realm of what people dared to say and what they dared to doubt. When a society's fears change, its future changes with them. France had once taught him that a few lines could send a man to the Bastille. By the end, he had taught France that a few lines could send a court into embarrassment, a verdict into reversal, and an institution into self-doubt. That is not the power of a throne. It is the quieter, more modern power of a public mind, acting at distance, reshaping what a civilization finds acceptable. And it is worth noticing, in the last light of his life, how much of this depended not on abstract virtue, but on the very worldly conditions he never forgot. Money enough to be independent, borders close enough to escape, printers willing to risk, readers willing to be provoked, and a state vain enough to fear ridicule. The age of thrones and altars did not end with him, but after him it could no longer pretend that it ruled a world where no one was laughing.